Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing and the Sword Studies series. So today I'm going to be looking at a British Dragoon sword, which is approximately from the 1770 to 1790 period, or possibly just beyond. It could range up to about 1800. So in the late 18th century, there was no standardization of British swords until 1788, and even then it's arguable that there wasn't really a standardization at that point beyond what the individual regiments did, a standardization within that regiment. So for example, Gaspard Le Marchant, who was fundamental in overhauling British swords and swordsmanship in the 1790s, when he was in the Low Countries in the early 1790s, he said that there was barely a regiment with the same sword. And so, yes, you'll find masses of swords that look the same, that are patterned as such, but they're not army-wide patterns, they're regimental, for example. And the armories, they have huge collections, hundreds of examples of certain types that you can tell have been made in large quantities, mass-produced, like this one. And this is the one that they classify under their own system as the Type U. And that is just an internal classification, but it's quite useful when we talk about these particular swords. So this is a Type U Dragoon sword of approximately 1770 up to maybe even 1800. Even though new regulations came in, it didn't always happen overnight. So particularly cavalry swords could be in service for a good few years beyond the new regulations. Okay, so what is this? Well, like a lot of cavalry dragoon or heavy dragoon swords we've looked at, it is a long, single-edged or backsword blade with a solid amount of hand protection. And so how different is this to the half or three-quarter basket hilt that I showed, or the 1796 Trooper? Again, fundamentally, it's not vastly different, as they still have much the same in common of having a long, straight blade that is single-edged and a solid amount of hand protection. There's not a huge amount of difference between any of them. There's subtle differences. And so this hilt, this is what we would call a slot hilt, a very typical slot hilt. So this form of slots came in approximately 1760, maybe just before, but around about 1760. So slot hilts were really quite common throughout, say, the American War of Independence, on both sides for that matter. And some slot hilts have additional protection. So this slot hilt has additional bars on the side, which mean that fundamentally this sword ends up having about the same level of protection overall and coverage as a later 3-bar saber. So the 3-bar sabers became common from the 1821 cavalry regulations onwards. And so it's kind of very similar to that later 3-bar design, which we know was very popular and very successful. The big difference being is that it still has a pommel, is that back straps were starting to become popular in Britain in the 1780s, but they didn't become completely dominant realistically until at least the 1796 regulation, and even then pommels lasted on for certain swords like spadroons and certain hangers and stuff like that. So yeah, pommels remained in service well into the early 19th century, even though back straps were becoming increasingly dominant. The blade itself is double fullered. It has a wide central fuller and a narrow back fuller. So the back fuller stops, the narrow fuller stops here. The central fuller continues on realistically until the tip. It is long. Now, British Dragoon swords of the 1770s and 1780s are often very long, as in the kind of similar length to, say, the French palashes, the cuirassiers swords of the Napoleonic era, which were known to be very long. The difference is, of course, those swords were mostly intended as thrust swords. They're like small lances, whereas these British swords are designed more for cutting, even though they can thrust. So the blade is 92 centimeters. That's 36 1/4 inches. So it's long. For any 18th century sword, that is very long. It has a lot of reach, massive amount of reach. Has a good thrusting tip, which you might find curious considering the heavy cavalry swords that came in 1796 had the famously blunt hatchet tip, which everybody complained about and eventually got modified. So clearly they were doing the right tips before that. Why did they end up with a blunt hatchet tip? Well, because they just directly copied an old Austrian sword from decades before, rather than progressing on with their designs. Aside from that, the blade is a bit narrower than the later heavy cavalry swords, but yes, longer. The grip, as you can see, a bit like that Dragoon sword I showed, and especially like the heavy cavalry, it's actually huge. It's like, if I push my hand to the top, again I have medium-sized hands, it's an absolutely massive hilt, which you could thumbs up the back if you wanted, although it's a bit of a handful. Again, I think the large grips on these and large hilts are in large part to give more protection and to counterbalance the long and often heavy blades that they've got. Now, this is not a hugely heavy sword, but it's still pretty weighty for what it is. So, put it on the scales, it is 974 grams, which puts it just below the average of a 1796 trooper's sword. So it's you know, it's a little bit lighter than what came after it on average, despite the fact that it's also a bit longer in the blade length. And so the swords of this period also were known to have some durability issues, and I suspect that's why, therefore, they adopted the big old Austrian Palash, to have something just a bit more robust. But nonetheless, this is a pretty good blade. It's got some flex, but it's fairly stiff. It's got some good striking power. It's quite nimble. It's got a good tip on it, and yes, it actually has really good protection. As ever, if you put thick big bars on the outside of the guard, it does pull a little bit to one side, but it's comfortable on the uniform side, and the slots do provide good protection to the thumb, whilst now we've got a huge amount of extra protection on the outer bars. Let's have a look at the balance. Remembering this is a big sword. So, balance, funnily enough, 14 centimeters. So that balance is very typical of a later 1796 heavy cavalry. So it's a little bit lighter and a little bit longer, as in it's lighter for its size, but because it is longer, it's got that extra mass, so it ends up coming out very similar. So it's got a little less striking power, I would say, than the 1796s, but it's got a bit of extra reach. Let's look at how the blade breaks down. At the shoulder, 8.2 millimeters. I always like to see that. I love seeing 8mm plus blades. They feel fantastic, feel nice and rigid in the hands and great on the parries. 5mm at the midpoint of the blade, about 10 to 15 from the end. It's down to 1.8, and it stays at 1.7 at the tip. So actually, it's quite thick. I mean, a lot of Napoleonic era blades, they go down to sort of 1mm and below at the tip. Whereas you can see this one fullers right up to the end, which is the way that, say, a lot of spadroons are done. And funnily enough, this blade does look like a giant spadroon blade, which, you know, it's basically what it is. A spadroon is a small broad or back sword, and this is a actual broad or back sword. So there you go, a Dragoon sword from about 1770, ranging up to about 1775, and it could have gone on a few years afterwards. Quite a nice piece, actually. Quite a nice sword. It looks old in style compared to what came after it, particularly because of the big bulbous pommel. But yeah, ultimately a nice all-rounder. I haven't done the profile taper. Profile taper 3.15 at the shoulder, halfway point down to 2.45, so that has a fair amount of taper. In the last 10 centimeters, it's down to 2 centimeters. So yeah, it actually has a bit more profile taper than you'd often see in a lot of, say, 1796 sabres and broadswords. That is the Dragoon sword. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.